Okay, so welcome to another deep dive, and this time we're going deep into the history of philosophy.
Deep.
Yeah, we're going to be taking a look at Aristotle's categories.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so
Big one.
this is a really big one, and we're going to be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy as our guide for this one.
Excellent resource.
It is a great resource for this, and I think, anyone who's spent any time in philosophy has probably encountered the categories in some form or another.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can't really avoid it.
Right. And I think that, it's one of those texts that even if you've read it, 5, 10 years ago, it's worth revisiting.
Always something new to find.
Yeah, there's always something new. And plus, it's so foundational to so much of Western philosophy.
I mean, the number of thinkers who were influenced by it is incredible.
Right, exactly. So we're going to try to give a sort of useful introduction to the main ideas in the categories.
Yeah, just a taste.
Yeah, and kind of point out some of the areas where, there's still debate going on.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Because there's some real head scratchers in there.
Right, exactly. So we're going to be looking at two main systems of classification that Aristotle presents in the categories.
Okay.
One is the fourfold division of beings, and the other is the tenfold division, which is, those are the categories proper.
They're the famous 10.
Yeah. So let's start with the fourfold division, because I think that that's a good place to sort of set the stage.
Yeah, good foundation.
So Aristotle's trying to figure out, how to classify beings, and that's the Greek term ta onta.
Talanta.
Yeah, and he does this by using two main distinctions. One is said of, and the other is present in.
Okay, two pretty loaded distinctions.
Yeah, and here's where it gets a little tricky, because Aristotle doesn't really give us a, clear-cut definition of what he means by said of and present in.
Yeah, classic Aristotle leaves you wanting a bit more.
Right, exactly, and that's
Yep.
part of what's made the categories such a, a source of debate for centuries.
Kept the philosophers busy.
Right, but we can kind of work it out based on the examples that he gives and the way that he uses the terms.
Yeah, gotta read between the lines.
So the general idea is that said of relates to universals,
Okay.
and not said of relates to particulars.
So universals, things that are true of many things.
Right, exactly. And particulars are the individual specific things.
This table, as opposed to the concept of table.
Exactly. Yeah, and then present in seems to have to do with accidental characteristics.
Accidental meaning.
Like qualities that a thing can have, but that aren't essential to what it is.
Okay, so I have the quality of wearing a blue shirt,
Yeah.
but that's not essential to me being me.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great example. And then not present in would be the non-accidental or the essential characteristic.
The things that make a thing what it is.
Right. So if we take these two distinctions and we sort of cross them over each other,
Make a little grid.
we get 4 different classes of beings.
Okay, 4 quadrants.
Yeah, so the first class is things that are said of and present in, and these are called accidental universals.
Accidental universals.
So an example of this would be like knowledge or whiteness.
Okay.
So these are universals because they can be true of many different things.
Right, lots of people have knowledge, lots of things are white.
Right, but they're accidental because they're not essential to the being of those things.
So, like, my knowledge of philosophy isn't what makes me me.
Right.
It's just something I have.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then the next category is things that are said of but not present in, and these are called essential universals.
Essential universes. Right.
Okay, and Aristotle gives the example of man as an essential universal.
Okay.
So the concept of man is said of all individual men.
Right.
But it's not just an accidental property of those men.
It's part of their essence. It's what makes them a man.
Right, it's what makes them a man. Yeah. And then we move to the not said of side of things. So the first category there is things that are not said of, but present in. And these are accidental particulars.
Accidental particulars, got it.
And Aristotle's example here is like a particular piece of grammatical knowledge.
Okay, so like my knowledge of the subjunctive mood.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or, Socrates' whiteness.
Okay, his specific shade of white.
Yeah. So this is a particular instance of whiteness that's present in Socrates, but it's not essential to what Socrates is.
Right, and it can't exist without Socrates.
Right. It can't exist without Socrates. Yeah. And then the final category is things that are not said of and not present in. And these are primary substances.
Primary substance is the bottom of the pyramid.
Yeah, and this is really the foundation of Aristotle's ontology.
This is what's really real for him.
Right, so primary substances are things like, an individual man or a horse.
This horse right here.
Right, this horse right here. Yeah. And these are the things that are not predicated of anything else.
Right. They're not said of
Oh,
anything.
but everything else is predicated of them.
There's kind of the anchor.
Yeah, they're the anchor. They're the starting point.
I mean, it's a pretty intuitive idea in a way, right?
Mhm.
Like, we look around us and we see individual things.
Yeah, it's very common sense in a way.
But it leads to some really interesting philosophical consequences.
Yeah, for sure. And, even this fourfold division has had its share of critics and alternative interpretations.
Oh, yeah? Philosopher is going to philosopher.
Right. Like,
Yeah.
G.E.L. Owen, for example, he argued against the existence of non-substantial particulars.
So he was saying that there's no such thing as, like, Socrates' whiteness as a particular...
Right. He thought that those were actually accidental universals.
Just at a very low level of generality.
Right. So instead of saying Socrates' whiteness, you would say the whiteness of things that are exactly like Socrates.
Which gets pretty complicated.
Yeah, it gets pretty complicated. Yeah, but it just goes to show that even at this basic level, there's a lot of room for debate.
Yeah, and that's just the first system.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
So now let's move on to the tenfold division.
The big one.
Yeah, the categories proper.
Yeah.
So here Aristotle is trying to classify things that are said telegomena. Yeah, and he divides them into 10 categories.
Here we go.
Substance, quality, relation.
When position being acted upon.
Yeah, those are the 10. And one of the big questions that comes up right away is what exactly is Aristotle classifying here?
Yeah, what are these categories pointing to?
Right. Is he classifying words or concepts or things in the world?
That's a big debate.
Yeah, and there are good arguments on all sides.
For sure.
Like the term category itself comes from the Greek word for predicate.
Right.
So that suggests that he's classifying words.
But then he also uses examples that seem to refer to things in the world like a man or a horse.
Right, exactly. And, Aristotle's overall philosophy is very much grounded in the idea that words and concepts refer to things in the world.
Yeah, so it's all connected.
Right, so it's probably a bit of both.
A tangled web.
Yeah, but for our purposes, I think it's helpful to focus on the extra linguistic interpretation.
So thinking of the categories as ways that things in the world can be.
Right, because I think that gives us a more intuitive grasp of what Aristotle's trying to do.
Okay, so these are like the ultimate ways things can be.
Right, so if we take an example like a maple tree.
Okay.
Well, it's a maple tree, which is a kind of tree, which is a kind of plant, which is a kind of living thing.
Right, getting more and more general.
Yeah, so the question is, does this process of becoming more general ever end?
And if so, where does it end?
Right, and that's what Aristotle's trying to figure out with the categories.
He's looking for the top level.
Yeah, the highest kinds.
The ultimate buckets.
Right, and he argues that being itself can't be the highest kind.
Okay, so everything can't just fall into the category of being.
Right, because he thinks that every genus has to be differentiated by something outside of itself.
Okay.
So if being were a genus, then it would have to be differentiated by non-being.
Which doesn't make much sense.
Right, he thinks that non-being is just incoherent.
Can't have a category for what isn't.
Right, so instead he proposes these 10 different categories.
10 ultimate ways of being.
Right, and within each category you have this hierarchy of genus, species, and individual.
So like with substance, you have animal as a genus,
Right.
human as a species,
Right.
and then individual humans.
Right, and if we think back to the fourfold division,
Okay.
we can see how that fits in here.
Overlapping systems.
Yeah, so primary substances,
Those individual things.
those are the things that are not said of and not present in.
They're their own category.
Right, and they're really the most important category for Aristotle.
The foundation.
Yeah, because he thinks that if primary substances didn't exist, nothing else would either.
It all goes back to the individuals.
Right, and this is a big difference from Plato, who thought that the forms were more real than individual things.
So for Plato, the form of beauty is more real than any beautiful thing.
Right, but for Aristotle, it's the other way around.
This chair is more real than the concept of chair.
Right, yeah. And this is where the idea of pros hen homonyms comes in.
Pros hen homonyms.
Yeah, so if being itself isn't a genus,
Right.
how can we say that all things are beings?
What do they have in common?
Right, and Aristotle's answer is that they're all related to substance,
Okay.
which is the primary being.
the focal point.
Yeah, so everything is a being in relation to substance.
That's how we can talk about being in a meaningful way.
Right, and that's why in his Metaphysics, Aristotle says that the study of being is really the study of substance.
Got to start at the foundation.
Exactly.
Huh.
Yeah. So let's take a closer look at some of the individual categories now,
Right, let's dive in.
starting with substance.
Of course.
So we already talked about primary substance.
The individual things.
Yeah, but there's also secondary substance,
Which is
the genera and species.
categories.
Right. So like animal is a secondary substance.
And human.
And human, yeah. And Aristotle's other works give us a lot more detail about how he classifies secondary substances.
Fills it out.
Yeah, so he talks about immobile substances like the unmoved mover.
The ultimate cause of motion.
Right, and mobile substances, which are basically bodies.
Things that move.
Right, and mobile substances can be eternal.
Like the celestial spheres.
Right, or they can be destructible, like everything in the sublunary realm.
Down here on Earth.
Yeah, and then within destructible mobile substances, you have inanimate things and living things.
Plants, animals, and then humans at the top.
Right, so it's a very hierarchical system.
From the most general to the most specific.
Right, yeah. Okay, so next we have quantity.
Quantity.
And here Aristotle distinguishes between continuous quantity and discrete quantity.
Continuous versus discrete.
Yeah, so continuous quantities are things like a line,
Okay.
a surface, a body, time, place.
Okay, those all make sense.
Right, and then discrete quantities are things like number and speech.
Number and speech, okay.
Yeah, now this is where things start to get a little bit tricky. Well, some of the things that Aristotle lists as continuous quantities seem more like quantified things than quantities themselves.
Like how?
Well, like body, for example.
Okay.
A body is a physical object that has quantity.
Right, it has a size and a shape.
Right, but it's not quantity itself.
It's not like a pure number.
Right, and the same could be said for line and surface and even place.
If we're talking about a specific location.
Right, so it's kind of like if we said that a 5-foot-long table was a kind of length.
Yeah, that's weird.
It's not really, right?
Mixing categories.
Yeah, and it gets even weirder because Aristotle also classifies body as a substance.
Oh, that's a problem.
Yeah, because he says that a species can't belong to two different categories.
So is body a substance or a quantity?
Right. That's a big question.
Yeah, that's one for the scholars to debate.
Yeah, for sure. And then there are also questions about what Aristotle means by number.
Right.
And why he includes speech as a discrete quantity.
Yeah, those are a bit unclear.
Yeah, so there's definitely some ambiguity there.
Okay, so quantity, a little bit messy.
Yeah, a little bit messy. All right, so let's move on to relation.
Relation.
Yeah, so this is another one that can be a bit confusing.
How so?
Well, when we hear the word relation, we tend to think of it as a relation between two things.
Right, like taller than or father of.
Exactly, but Aristotle's term is ta pro ti, which means things towards something.
Okay, so not the relation itself, but the thing that's related.
Right, so he's classifying things insofar as they stand in a relation to something else.
So like a father is a father in relation to his child.
Exactly, yeah, and this is because Aristotle thinks that properties inhere in a single subject.
Okay.
So a thing can't have a property, it's only half there.
It can't be half collar.
Right, so the category of relation is kind of a way of dealing with relational predicates.
Without saying that relations are their own separate things.
Right, it's like a middle ground.
Okay, I see.
Yeah. All right, so finally we have quality.
Quality.
And this one seems a bit more straightforward.
How so?
Well, Aristotle divides quality into 4 kinds.
Okay.
Habits and dispositions, natural capabilities and incapabilities, affective qualities and affections, and shape.
Those all sound like qualities that things can have.
Right? They're all characteristics.
Pretty intuitive.
Yeah. But even here, there are some questions.
Like what?
Well, Aristotle doesn't really give us a clear reason for why he divides quality into these 4 specific kinds.
It doesn't explain his reasoning.
Right, and some philosophers like Ockrell and Firth have criticized this.
They think it's a bit arbitrary.
Yeah, they say that there's no clear principle behind the division.
Okay, so it seems a bit random.
Right, but other philosophers like Aquinas have tried to come up with justifications for the division.
You've tried to find a system in it.
Right, so Aquinas connects habits and dispositions to the nature of the subject, affective qualities, to action and passion, and shape to quantity.
Okay, so he's trying to ground the categories in Aristotle's broader metaphysics.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So even though there's debate about whether Aristotle himself had these kinds of justifications in mind, it's interesting to see how later philosophers have tried to make sense of the categories.
It shows how influential they've been.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so now that we've looked at some of the individual categories,
Yeah.
let's step back and ask a bigger question.
Hit me with it.
Where did these categories come from?
Yeah. How did Aristotle come up with this list?
And why should we think that it's the right list?
Is it just arbitrary, or is there a method to the madness?
Right. That's a huge question.
The million-dollar question.
Yeah, and it's one that philosophers have been debating for centuries.
For sure.
And there are two main ways to approach this question.
Okay.
One is from an internal perspective.
Internal.
Yeah. So we assume that there is a correct system of categories,
Okay.
and we try to figure out how Aristotle arrived at that system.
So we're playing by his rules.
Right. And the other way is from an external perspective.
External.
Yeah. So we question the whole idea of fixed categories.
Maybe there's no right answer.
Right. Maybe it's all just a matter of convention or something.
Interesting.
Yeah. And Aristotle himself definitely takes the internal perspective.
He thinks there's a right answer.
Right. He's a realist about categories.
He thinks they reflect the structure of reality.
Exactly. Yeah. But the frustrating thing is that he doesn't really give us a clear procedure for how he arrived at his list.
He doesn't show his work.
Right. And this has led to a lot of criticism.
Philosophers want to see the receipts.
Right. Like Kant famously said that Aristotle just picked up the categories as they came his way.
Like he was just wandering around and bumping into them.
Yeah, basically. So philosophers have tried to come up with different ways to explain how Aristotle might have derived the categories.
Trying to reconstruct his thought process.
Right. So one approach is the question approach.
Question approach.
Yeah, and this is the idea that you can derive the categories by asking questions.
So like what questions?
Well, like what is it?
Oh,
Or
yeah.
what kind of thing is it? Or
Yeah.
how much is there?
So different questions will lead you to different categories.
Right. So if you ask what is it about a horse,
Okay.
the answer will be something like a horse, which is a substance.
Okay, makes sense.
And if you ask how much is there, the answer will be a quantity.
Yeah.
But there are some problems with this approach.
Like what?
Well, first of all, it's not clear that it actually yields all 10 of Aristotle's categories. And second of all, it seems kind of dependent on our question-asking habits.
Like what if we ask a different question?
Right. What if we ask a question that doesn't fit into any of the 10 categories?
Yeah, that would be a problem.
Yeah. So another approach is the grammatical approach.
Grammatical approach.
Yeah. And this is the idea that Aristotle derived the categories from the structure of language.
Okay, so our language shapes our category.
Right. So, for example, the subject-predicate structure of sentences.
Okay.
That's seen as reflecting the distinction between substance and its attributes.
So the subject is the substance and the predicate is the attribute.
Right. And the fact that we have active and passive verbs, that's seen as grounding the categories of acting and being acted upon.
Interesting.
Yeah. But again, there are some problems with this approach.
Like,
Well, why should we think that the structure of our language perfectly mirrors the structure of reality?
yeah, maybe our language is just arbitrary.
Right. Maybe it's just a historical accident.
Okay, I see.
Yeah. So another approach is the modal approach.
Modal approach.
Yeah, and this is the idea that the categories represent the kinds of things that every particular has to be related to.
Okay.
So every particular has to be a substance.
Okay.
And it has to have qualities and quantities, and
Yeah.
it has to exist in time and place.
Yeah.
So these are all modal relations. They're necessary relations.
Every particular has to have them.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. But again, there are some problems with this approach.
Such as?
Well, it doesn't really explain why Aristotle shows these 10 specific categories.
Right.
Like, why isn't there a category for particulars themselves?
Yeah. Good point.
Or for matter?
Hmm.
Yeah. So finally, we have the medieval derivational approach.
Medieval derivational approach.
Yeah, and this is the idea that you can derive the categories from first principles.
So like a pure logical deduction.
Right. So Aquinas, for example,
Okay.
he connects quantity to matter and quality to form.
So the categories are grounded in Aristotle's hylomorphism.
Right. And this is a really interesting idea.
Yeah.
But the problem is that Aristotle might not have had a fully developed theory of hylomorphism when he was writing the categories.
So it might be anachronistic.
Right. We might be reading later ideas back into the text.
Yeah, that's always a danger when you're dealing with ancient philosophy.
Right. Yeah. So the question of how Aristotle derived the categories is still very much an open one.
A mystery for the ages.
Yeah, and it's one that scholars are still actively working on.
Always more to discover.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of recent scholarship on the categories,
Okay.
there are two main trends that I've noticed.
What are they?
Well, one is just a continued interest in Aristotle's categorialism as a topic in its own right.
So people are still trying to figure out how it all fits together.
Right. They're looking at how the categories relates to Aristotle's other works,
Okay.
and they're also trying to reevaluate the ontology of the categories in light of contemporary philosophical debates.
So seeing how it holds up in the 21st century.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And the other trend is a focus on the historical influence of the categories.
Okay, so looking at how it's shaped the history of philosophy.
Right. So people are looking at how medieval philosophers interpreted the categories
Okay.
and how it influenced later thinkers like Hegel and Peirce.
So tracing its legacy.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So to sum up,
Okay.
Aristotle's Categories is a really complex and influential work.
That's putting it mildly.
Yeah, it's given rise to centuries of debate.
And it's still relevant today.
Right. It's still shaping the way we think about the world.
So what's the big takeaway for our listeners?
Well, I think the main thing is that there are many different ways to interpret the categories.
No easy answers.
Right, and there's no one right answer to the question of how Aristotle derived the categories.
Still an open question.
Yeah, but even though it's a difficult text,
For sure.
it's also a really rewarding one,
Absolutely.
and it's worth grappling with.
It'll make you a better philosopher.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So I encourage everyone to go and check out the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on the categories.
Great resource.
Yeah, and also to read some of the works by the philosophers that we've mentioned.
Get your hands dirty.
Yeah, and think about how Aristotle's ideas might still be influencing us today.
Maybe without us even realizing it.
Right, yeah. And on that note, thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Always a pleasure.
And we'll see you next time.
Okay. See you then.